So what do we do with those situations where the church apparently seems to have even, or not that, I will refrain from saying the church, but Christians have discriminated against saints, okay? So there's a few things here to start with, because there's attitudinal questions, like how do we even begin to start that conversation? How do we think about this? How do we feel about it? How do we talk about it? Slavery and racism, right? Difficult ideas. Well, some of the things that I think are most important to bring to the conversation are moral clarity, which isn't always easy to find in human history. There's a lot of muddiness in the past. But nevertheless, I think we need to be sympathetic where we can, but we also need to be able to say, this is right and this is wrong. I think it's important, though, that we also be able to have some sort of shared history. In other words, that we can see the past as all of our stories and not just some of our stories. So in an attempt to try to do that, I think in 2018, a document from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops came out called Open Wide Our Hearts. And it's a document that's about racial issues in the United States and about racism in the United States as well. And what it does is it proposes that we think about these issues in what I'll call a confessional model, meaning like we think about it in the same way that we think about it ourselves when we're going to go to confession to a priest. And what's part of that? Well, when you go confess your own sins to a priest, there's a few steps, right? You're supposed to examine your conscience. You're supposed to confess your sins and your failures of holiness. You're supposed to resolve to try to be more holy and to be better in the future. And they give you something called penance at the end, right? That tells you, okay, can you do? Sometimes, historically, it was often connected with the things that you'd done, right? So try to make up for the things that you've done in the past. And so those four things, I think, I can identify in that document that the bishops promoted, right? To say, well, that's the same way we should be thinking about issues around racism in Christian history. We need to be doing some penance, potentially, or repentance, and but also frank recognition of the past, the examination of conscience bit. Before I go into some of the history here, it's actually important, I think, for us to talk about what we mean by these words first. Slavery is used in a lot of ways. The word slavery is used in a lot of ways. In the New Testament even, there are places where, like, St. Paul describes himself as Jesus' slave, right? So what does that mean, right? So, like, there's a wide variety of uses that this word has. And, for instance, like, Merriam-Webster uses such a broad definition that it's very confusing. Like, it doesn't really mean much to me. It says submission to a dominating influence. What's that? At least that's the first definition, I think. And that means there's all kinds of things there. But it covers the thing that St. Paul is talking about when he calls himself Jesus' slave, because he sees Jesus as his superior and he submits to Jesus. Okay, I guess that's slavery then, you know. So that's not going to be enough of a definition for what we're going to need to do tonight, because you'll note that definition doesn't have any moral qualifiers. And I talked about having some moral clarity in my last slide as well. So I think St. John Paul II can help us here. In a document of his called Veritatis Splendor, he has a list of things that he calls intrinsically evil. And on that list, he includes slavery. Note, not just some kind of slavery, not some certain forms of it from the past, but slavery, right? And I think that's important. If we're going to talk about being clear here, anything that is properly slavery is what John Paul II calls evil. Okay. So a definition that I've tried to work up over my years of teaching here is something like this. The claim of ownership of the body or productive work of another human being without just consideration of that person's actions. I think that that's what John Paul II's thinking about when he talks about slavery, at least. And note that it can be both the person themselves that's owned, but it can also be their labor that's owned. And different forms of slavery have done different things in that way in the past. And that it doesn't take consideration of that person's actions. In other words, it's unjust, and that's what John Paul II is also saying. So I'm going to include that moral tone to the word when I use it here. It's a bad thing. Okay. Racism, on the other hand, in Merriam-Webster, I think today, the definition is something like this: a belief that race is a fundamental determinant of human traits and capabilities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. Well, that's fine. I have used a different definition and worked on a new definition or a different definition in some of my teaching as well. And I'm not going to quibble over it, but my preferred definition is on the screen. We don't even need to talk about that right now. But it does combine it with what I'll call cultural power as well, right? To say that it's not just about attitudes toward other groups, but it's about the ability to say, I'm better than you, and I can actually make something happen to you because of that. Okay. I'm going to be pointing to evidence then from the New Testament and early Christianity that supports this way of thinking about slavery. So, for instance, St. Paul, in some of his letters, uses this phrase in Galatians: in Christ Jesus, there is neither slave nor free. In other words, he sees in the early Christian community some sort of response to cultural institutions in his place and time that amounted to relationships of domination and submission, and to say that Christianity somehow does not do that thing. Somehow. Now, okay, there's other examples in letters that seem to say that it's okay, but I have other things to say about those. Another prominent example is the letter of Philemon, in which St. Paul also says, who is it? Onesimus, I believe, is the slave in the text. He returns Onesimus to his master, but he encourages the master to receive him back no longer as a slave, but as a brother. So it seems that St. Paul is aware that there's something going on here, that Christianity has something that it needs to say to this situation, right? Even if he's not saying it perfectly clearly, maybe. But I take this as evidence that the New Testament recognizes that some parts of the Roman institutions of slavery need to be changed, right? That they're not being done correctly. It's not a just way of ordering a human society. Let's say it like that. But at the same time, Christianity in the first century was not in a position to overthrow the Roman Empire. And it wasn't going to be able to get rid of the institutions of slavery that were part of that empire. So it's not surprising to me that there's no just out and out condemnation of slavery in the New Testament for that reason alone. And when we turn to the period where Christianity actually does start to be in charge of things in the 4th century, when the Roman emperors become Christian, we start to see it at that same time, Christian theologians saying that slavery is not okay. And St. Gregory of Nyssa is certainly the most prominent example of this from the 4th century. So I'll read a couple, if that's okay, a couple of things that he had to say in one of his homilies. He says, basically, this I'll summarize it. How much money do you think the equivalent is? How much money do you want to exchange for the likeness of God? So in other words, he's acknowledging, right, that slaves have a right to a certain sort of dignity simply because they are human beings. If the slave is in the likeness of God, who is his buyer? Tell me. Who is his seller? To God alone belongs this power. Or rather, not even to God himself, for God has spontaneously freed Israel from bondage and humankind from slavery to sin. And so he concludes, if God does not enslave what is free, who is he that sets his own power above God's? Pretty powerful claim at the end there, right? Basically, he's accusing slave owners of the same kinds of pride that caused Satan to fall, right? Putting themselves above God and above God's authority. So he doesn't mince words there, right? And you'll note then that he connects the idea of the image of God to the idea that humans are innately free and that they cannot be held in slavery to another human being. That's really important. So if we get these witnesses in early Christianity, where do things go wrong? That's what I think is the hardest thing maybe to try to figure out at times. There's a lot of failures here. And I think one of the ways to help make sense of it is to talk about Christian-Muslim conflicts in the period after the rise of Islam. So there's a set of two associations from the period of like the Crusades that come to be developed between Islam, Muslims, and other things. And so in these two lines, I say, well, Christians associated Muslims with heresy, and through heresy, Christians also associated Muslims with Satan. Christians then also associated the places where those Muslims were with those ideas, right? So many Muslims were in North Africa, and many of the people in North Africa then also had dark skin. Okay, so then we put a circle around those ideas, right? This is like just a sort of set of mental associations that come to be developed through the centuries. And these develop into a theology, frankly, right? Like a belief about these people that they think derives from Christianity. That says it's called the Curse of Ham. And it was an interpretation of Genesis 9:25, because when Noah gets off the boat, he's got 3 sons. And Ham, instead of getting a blessing like his 2 brothers, is cursed and he's told that he's going to be his brother's slave. Oh, slave? Right? Okay, so this is important too, because now we see one of the patriarchs of ancient Judaism, but also Christianity, I suppose you'd say then, telling one of his children that they're going to be a slave. Okay. And so then this then gets reinterpreted. Ham and his descendants are called the Canaanites then. And they come to associate Canaan and Canaanites with these features that I just described. So Cain, on the one hand, is from men, or the Canaanites are seen as the ones who have darker skin. This darker skin is then interpreted as a marker of aggressive and hypersexual behaviors. In other words, that people with this darker skin are just innately more vicious, right? That they have stronger desires that are harder to control. And so the solution in the Curse of Ham narrative is to say that we need to enslave them in order to rein in those desires. that they have. Now, all of this is, I want to make sure it's clear that none of this is true and none of this is good, but this is some ideas that these people had at this time. Right? But so essentially this means, though, that when Christians go to these peoples, they thought it was their duty to enslave them in order to Christianize them as much as they could be Christianized, because they're always going to have these strong desires. And we, other people who aren't from the line of Ham, are able to control our desires better, and we can control their desires for them. Is that making some sense? I mean, I know that it doesn't need to make...
I understand what you're saying, but it doesn't make sense to me.
Yes, no, I mean, absolutely. And none of this is, the idea that Ham has darker skin is not in the biblical text, right? So they're, making things up to sort of make this work. But that's what they did. And so this then is the origin of this association between race and slavery. Right? You can see how slavery now becomes a system that's used against particular peoples. And then in the next 6 slides, we're going to have to go through some examples of the consequences of this idea. We don't need to do all of it. If we need to end earlier than that, that's fine too. I can try to wrap it up as quick as you need to be done. But here's some stuff. So some of the earliest failures of holiness on this question during the colonial period, so we're now into the 15th century, have to do with popes going back and forth on the question of whether slavery is okay or not. So in Eugene IV is a pope in the early 15th century, 1435. He actually put out a document related to the Canary Islands, which were relatively newly discovered off the African coast. And the rule he came up with in that situation was to say that if someone converts to Christianity on those islands, it doesn't make sense to keep those people as a slave. So it was a limitation, but it was only a limitation when it was a Christian convert, right? So in other words, if someone remained a pagan or whatever they would have called them on the island, those people could still be enslaved. But if they convert, then you have to let them go.
I guess I'm confused about them being slaves. Are they slaves like we consider the slaves in the United States? We bought them. When they're trying to convert these people, they actually owned them?
So, I mean, they probably would have been in different relationships. There probably would have been tribes that were not under the direct control of European powers at different points here, right? But as they came to control those areas, they would have taken many of them, I suppose, as slaves. I don't know how many or to what extent, I guess. If they would have left some parts of them behind and only took the strong men or something, perhaps, I don't know. But yeah, right. In this case, it was more or less limited to this group of islands, though, off of the African coast.
I think you're talking about on the prior slide too.
Sure.
So in order to convert them, they make them slaves. That's what
Yeah.
was bothering me.
Yeah. No, and it should bother you. That's.
Did they just think they're better than them? Is that what they shoved the slavery was, or was it actually they owned these people?
Well, I mean, both, maybe. I mean, they thought that they were better than them because of this curse of Ham thing, right? Because they would have said, you guys will never be able to control your desires the way that we can. Did you want to say something too?
Yeah, I do. And I'm just thinking back to what happened in Mexico. It's not that they own them. It's just like the whole society changes when the Europeans came over. So everything changes. People didn't have a way to defend themselves. So it's not like you own them, but there's a lot of special things that happen in where do they get food, where do they live, or things like this.
Yeah, they could control a lot of different parts of their life.
Yeah, they got control of the land, they got control of the water.
They were talking to each other
So
about
that
it.
makes sense.
Yeah.
Because I
It's hard to cut this, I think. I don't know how to do it.
Yeah.
I didn't live it.
No, yeah, and it's hard to imagine what it looks like on the ground. I mean, you have to do some imaginative work to try to think about what it would have been like. Yeah, right, yeah.
So you explained it very well. So, yeah, it's just the same thing as a whole, basically, and it's sort of like the United States with the Americans.
Potentially, yes, right. I'm not trying to deny it, yeah. One of the unique factors here too is, right, well, when we get to the transatlantic stuff, right, with the slave trade,
Yeah.
I mean, the density of slavery in those populations makes it a particularly egregious example, I think. Yeah. But essentially, like, this is Eugene IV kind of saying no to slavery for a little bit. But then another little bit later, not that much later though, 1450s, it was 1430s before, kind of goes back on it and says, actually, you know, this is a letter written to King Alfonso I of Portugal. It's a papal bull, actually. And he tells this king, if you're going to be out there, we want you to help spread Christianity for us in these places. And while you're out there, you need workers. So basically, we're just going to give you permission to, when you go to, like, especially West Africa, you have permission to take slaves from those populations and hold them as slaves indefinitely. And yeah, right, yeah. And this is what Pope Nicholas V tells this king of Portugal. I would say so. Yeah, I mean, you know, this is actually a pretty hard case example because, right, we talk about the popes being infallible on matters of faith and morals, for instance. But this is one of those instances, and there's one other in the 8th century that I use as an analogy for this, where a pope, in his case, it was actually a matter of faith, where he held a belief about Jesus that was later declared heretical by an ecumenical council. So this just shows you that popes can be pretty wrong on matters of faith and morals. Yeah, that's all I'll say. But I'm not. There is a way to talk about infallibility still around those examples, but it's you have to be pretty careful. Okay. So then, you know, so he kind of says no to slavery for a while. Oh wait, no. This one though is back to like that. He was back to like, yes, slavery. And then the one after him here now is Paul III, and this is almost a century later here, 1537, into the era of the Reformation now, right? Paul III, under the influence of a guy named Bartolomé de las Casas, he was sort of a historian, I guess you could say, in the Americas, who reported back to Spain about some of the practices that were happening against indigenous populations, and convinces Paul III that this can't be okay and that something needs to be done. And this text called Sublimis Deus is an example of a very clear condemnation of indigenous slavery and land theft. And he says,
good. I think you gotta talk
of the
after
land
Mass
theft
for
stuff, I'm from South Dakota, where the Sioux and Lakota tribes are, right, there's this dispute around the Black Hills, for instance, there. Well, I mean, they could use Paul III's words very clearly to say that Catholics need to support that effort, frankly, because Paul III says that if any indigenous folk are enslaved, and if any of their property is taken away, those actions are to be null and void. So basically, like, they have no effect in laws. If he has anything to say about it, those things don't count. Unfortunately, he didn't have as much to say about it as he would have liked to, however. And unfortunately, again, in the next year, he rescinded the document under the influence of the Spanish king. The Spanish king said, like, hey, we can't work with this. And so he said, fine, I won't enforce it. So we're back to sort of not slavery for a little bit, but then we're back to, okay, I guess we're just going to let it happen again. Kind of messy. And you're okay to shake your head. And then I put a meme in that you can't see from here, but it's supposed to be them arguing with each other. Why can't we get along? Okay. Well, another slide. This one's pretty quick. These are all of the religious orders in the modern-day United States that own slaves. These are all some of the institutions that own slaves.
Wait, I'm confused.
These
They
are some of the
currently own
bishops
slaves?
and folk who own slaves. And then there's lots of priests as well. Okay, so
These are modern-day organizations that
not
own
great
slaves.
there.
Yes.
And then some bishops were pretty audible in their support for slavery. So Bishop Augustine Verreau from Florida. Let's see. What does he have to say about this here? Oh, yeah, he's very opposed to the abolitionist movement. He served from 1858 to 1876. So he says, there has been in the northern, he's a southern bishop, right, from Florida. There has been in the northern part of the country an actual conspiracy against justice and truth. This conspiracy is headed by fanatical preachers who desecrate and pollute the divine word by arguing for abolition. And instead, he sought to institute what he called a kind and good slavery in the colonies. Another one, Bishop John England. He's actually a pretty big name, Charleston, North Carolina. He made an argument that the church in the past had regulated slavery. And so he argued the church can't condemn something that it regulates. So it must be okay. Bishop William Henry, Elder, there we go, from Mississippi, described slaves as animal and instinctual. Bishop Auguste Martin of Louisiana said this theology of the curse of Ham thing pretty clearly. He said that slavery humanizes the slaves by moving them from barbarism to civilization. And that slavery is in fact God's plan for black people and for their salvation. Bishop Francis Kenrick, the last example here. He makes an argument basically about, like, he recognizes that some slaves may not have been taken justly from Africa. I'm saying that in a way that he would agree with, at least, right? And he's trying to decide, like, whether the fact that they were originally stolen, essentially, means that they need to be freed today. And the phrase that he uses to describe the situation is, his argument is, defect of title must be considered cured by lapse of time. It's a weird phrase, but basically what he's saying is, even though these people were taken unjustly, the whole thing would fall apart if we freed them now, so it must be okay to keep them. So just like the gymnastics, right?
Well, it reminds me of all the stuff that's going on today, not related to slavery,
Sure. Yeah.
about a lot of things.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate that in instances like this, I mean, these bishops were actively engaged in throwing dust in the air to make it harder for people to figure out what the right thing to do was, right? And it's I won't say it's a uniquely American thing, but I will say that in many instances, Rome had a better perspective on the situation than people living here. And Rome, in many instances, throughout this period, is there to critique things that the American bishops are doing, saying, guys, you're not doing this right. So in that instance, the papacy is kind of one of the good guys here for sure. Yeah. Good. Go ahead.
I'm just wondering how much do people, as people can say about this, especially when these are very powerful men in the church.
Sure.
I think.
What do we say about these things?
Yeah. What do we say about it? What do people say about it?
Then or now?
Like then and now.
Well, I have some examples of responses to some of these bishops too. And the power dynamics, as you indicated, are complicated in a situation like that. But I would say there were priests. Do I have him in this presentation? Yeah, he's a little bit later on, who were willing to sort of stand up and say, even though you should take away my duties as a priest and my privileges as a priest, I'm going to continue to say that slavery is wrong. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, right. Indeed. Okay. Other examples. Sorry, this just keeps going. It's not a short list. And this is the short version of the presentation, I promise. There was a gathering of bishops 2 years after the end, 1866, 1 year after the end of the Civil War, called the Second Plenary Council of Baltimore. And it talks about the emancipation of the slaves. And it has some, I think, pretty disparaging things to say about them. It says that they have these peculiar dispositions and habits that are going to lead these former slaves in their sudden emancipation to not make a good use of their freedom, right? So basically it's saying that this sounds like that Curse of Ham stuff, right? Where they have these black slaves have these dispositions and habits, vices, right? That they're not going to be able to control now that they're not slaves anymore. Okay, that doesn't sound very good either. And that was a gathering of Catholic bishops right after the end of the Civil War, right? So that's not a great place to be. But laymen too. Orestes Brownson is a Catholic intellectual from the 19th century. He describes, I'll use his word, apologies, the African Negro as the degenerate man. He has ceased to be progressive, and when a race has ceased to be progressive, nothing remains for it but to die, he says. And then finally, the last example I'll use here at least, this is Roger Taney. He is the first Catholic Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And he was also the one who wrote the majority decision of the Dred Scott case, which was the fugitive slave law ruling that basically said that northern states have to return fugitive slaves to the southern states. Is that right? I think that's what the Dred Scott's describing. And the ruling says that black folks have no rights to which the white man is bound to respect. So public intellectuals amongst the church in that time didn't do a great job sometimes. This is all supposed to be examination of conscience material, is the idea, right?
I don't know if the audio
Yeah,
works.
it just keeps going, guys. I'm sorry.
I couldn't be
Should
done.
I get the kids?
There's only
There
like
was
5
an
minutes
attempt
left.
by Gregory the 16th in 1839 to condemn the slave trade. Again, an instance where the Pope was doing better work than the bishops
that in Michigan
in the
too?
United States. But the American bishops basically try to push it under the rug and say that it didn't apply to domestic slavery, just to like the transatlantic slave trade. We can still trade slaves here. It's that slave trade across the ocean that he's trying to condemn. The Second Plenary Council of Baltimore also got advice from Rome to establish a mission to African Americans after the end of the Civil War. Again, this is an instance where I think Rome was on the right page and saying, hey, you have all of these newly freed slaves. You should be out there trying to help them find their way to the church. And the Council of Baltimore says, that's too much work, basically. Like, we're not going to do it. And so there was no mission established for African Americans. We're not going to even try to go get them to become Catholic. All right. Yeah, so these are the moments that I'll call the sort of sitting on their hands. Let's see, Peter Kenrick, this is one of the bishops at that council. He said, if a new mission were established for blacks, it would seem as if the bishops had been previously remiss. Basically, he's saying like he doesn't want to admit that the bishops had been wrong. And so we're just going to continue to say the same thing that we have before. And like to establish a mission for them now means that we should have established a mission for them before. So we're not going to establish a mission for them now because we don't admit that we should have established a mission for them before. Indeed, right? If I admit that I'd robbed the man, then I'd have to give him his watch back. Something like that. Yeah, and then maybe I think this is the last example. Archbishop James Bailey of Baltimore. Oops, sorry. This was during the Reconstruction period in the 1860s or 70s, 60s and 70s. He said that on issues regarding education for black people, he had but little, quote, hope of any substantial good being done among the Negroes in America. You had to cut the head off first of those whom you wished to instruct. The antipathy was ineradicable. So he's basically saying that you can't teach black people. All right. That's after the Civil War, right? Oh, and this one is probably the hardest one, right? Sometimes we'll hear and think, and I've heard it said at least, that the problem with minority communities today is fatherlessness. That the problem is that black families are broken, and what they need is to just get off of welfare and stay married to their spouses and to the people that they're having children with, and raise a family together. Okay, well, all right. Perhaps there's a fatherlessness component to it. However, in the Reconstruction period and during the antebellum period before the war, the largest concentrations of Catholics were in Maryland and in Kentucky. And Kentucky was a southern state, and there were lots of plantations in Kentucky, and a lot of Catholics owned those plantations. So we have a lot of Catholics in Kentucky who were slave owners. And so what happens, these are just statistics here, you don't need to get into it too much, but this one's like the percentage of the Catholic population in different parts of Kentucky who own slaves. This next one is through time. It's diachronic about, oh no, I have them backwards actually. The first one is the one that talks about through time, what percentage of slave owning Catholics in the region the percentage of slave-owning Catholics in the region of Kentucky. They're high percentages, up to 40 to 50% of Catholics owned slaves in Kentucky during that time. Catholic newspapers before the war published sale notices for slaves. They also published fugitive slave notices with distinguishing features of slaves, telling them how to return them to their owners. And this is the tough one right here, that in these slaves, the slave populations, only about a quarter of these families had both parents present, because slavery often involved separating parents from their children and spouses from one another. And so these Catholic slave owners were effectively separating black families from one another, right? So again, if we're talking about fatherlessness as the problem, there are pretty deep roots to the problem, and these roots don't have to do with welfare programs. I'll say that much. Okay. So that just needs to be a piece of the conversation, it seems to me. I don't know. I can stop here. This is starting to get into the more, this is like Reconstruction to the Civil Rights era. And then we can talk about all the way up to George Floyd if we wanted to. But yeah. So, I mean, that gets us through a lot of the material up and through the Civil War, at least. I'm happy to take a break to stop here. So then, great. Then let me just skip through these ones for just a second. And what I'll say then, again, is just to remind us that this is not just about whipping ourselves about how bad Catholics have been about this stuff. It's to say that there really is a holiness of the church here, and that we need to find it in the people who put up with it. And again, there is a collection of stories of these saints and venerables that has recently been published that can tell you more about their lives and hopefully ways that we can try to imitate them. Now, there's all kinds of divides in our societies, but there's ways that we can try to fix it. Like our